You are listening to the Visualising War podcast. In each episode, we look at how people have experienced, described, or imagined armed conflict in different periods and places, and we discuss the impact which representations of war and peace can have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Alice Koenig, and I co-direct the Visualising War project at the University of St Andrews. Over the next few months, we're releasing a series of one-off podcast episodes connected to some new work we're doing on children's voices on war and peace, and on different ways of visualising conflict resolution and peace building. My guest today is Professor J. Marshall Beier, who's undergraduate chair in the Department of Political Science at McMaster University, and editor-in-chief of the journal Critical Studies on Security. In the course of a distinguished career, his research has focused particularly on political subjecthood, so the ways in which people are framed, imagined, and treated as political subjects, and the ways in which people in different places have resisted or challenged those framings. This interest has led him to work specifically on the relationship between politics and childhood, how children and childhood get conceived in political contexts, and what impact that can have on their political involvement as well as their lives more broadly. In the course of this research, Marshall has published extensively on the militarisation of childhood, as well as child and youth rights and youth political participation. Notable publications include edited volumes such as The Militarisation of Childhood, Thinking Beyond the Global South in 2011, Discovering Childhood in International Relations in 2020, and with Jana Tabak, Childhoods in Peace and Conflict 2021, among many other field-changing contributions. Marshall's research has also examined the inclusion and exclusion of Indigenous voices in global politics, and he's contributed to studies of contemporary and emerging weapon systems and the movement to ban anti-personnel landmines. He researches pedagogical practices as well as being an innovative teacher himself, and he's very involved with the McMaster Youth and Children University. So he has a very, very broad set of expertise, and it's wonderful to be able to welcome you, Marshall, to the podcast today. Thank you so much for making time to talk to me.
Well, thank you, Alice. I'm delighted to be here and grateful for the invitation.
So, Marshall, as you know, the Visualising War project is currently looking at two interrelated questions. What forces shape children's habits of visualising war and peace in different parts of the world? And also, what impact can children and young people's voices have on how we all view, imagine, understand and approach conflict and its resolution? And I wonder if we can just kick off with the first of those topics, so the forces that shape how children understand and experience conflict. As I understand it, for very good reasons, most of the research that's been done on how children get socialised into particular ways of thinking about war has focused on children who are directly affected by conflict. So children who are growing up in conflict zones, also child soldiers, for example. And I just wonder if you can give us a brief overview of that kind of research, maybe thinking about what parts of the world it's focused on and also what kinds of children it's looked at.
Absolutely. So context matters quite a lot here. It cuts a couple of different ways, already signaled by your remarks just now. And that is, there's the iconic figure of the child soldier, and there's also the child affected by armed conflict. In terms of where in the world, this differs a little bit. The child soldier in dominant imaginations is typically male, sub-Saharan African, prepubescent, armed with a weapon that seems to outsize his small stature. And so that speaks to where the parts of the world that are implicated in this typically as well. With some exceptions, the images we see of child victims of armed conflict more broadly tend to be of even younger children whose vulnerability is even more palpable. And here, this includes sub-Saharan Africa, but also the rest of Africa, the Middle East, some other places in moments of acute crisis or emergency and conflict. One thinks, for example, of the diminutive figure of 5-year-old Omran Daknish, right, photographed in 2016, sitting in the back of an ambulance in Aleppo, dazed, dust-covered, and became a symbol of the plight of Aleppo in the Syrian civil war. Another example out of the same part of the world, the very famous photos, disturbing photos of the lifeless body of 3-year-old Alan Kurdi being carried from a Turkish beach in 2015 after he, his mother, and his brother drowned in the Mediterranean while fleeing the civil war, also in Syria. More broadly, in the case of war-affected children, sometimes something like the image of a tiny shoe or a doll abandoned in the rubble left in the aftermath of an attack comes to signify child victims of armed conflict. In the 1990s, the campaign to ban landmines at its meetings frequently had a child-sized prosthetic limb positioned at the podium where speeches were given. And so in all of these appearances, it's the victimization of the child that really looms large, and in ways that give these images really powerful political resonance. Helen Brocklehurst describes this as children having been made the emotional scenery of global politics. And Katrina Lee Koo points out how, in terms of political currency, the value of children's suffering is in scripting state identity. So those responsible are delegitimized, while those who are able to position themselves in a remedial or interventionist role on behalf of children's security and well-being, well, they're on the side of the angels. Helen Behrens, she shows how images of children in abject circumstances variously open or foreclose political possibilities. So there's been the emergence of a rich literature on all of this in recent years, with some very thoughtful people continuing to advance these insights in ongoing work. But those are sort of the broad strokes of the two kinds of ways in which children, particularly of the global South, are positioned with respect to armed conflict.
So, Marshall, there you've given us some very vivid examples of the ways in which children in conflict are visualized very much as victims, the iconic figure of the child soldier, but even younger children are becoming symbols of victimhood and of suffering in war. Not even the child itself sometimes, but, a piece of clothing, the tiny shoe, or a toy, a doll abandoned in the rubble, as you said. And then the ways in which these images of childhood and images of children are used to condition and to shape the ways in which we visualize war generally. So that gets us thinking about the relationship between childhood and militarism. But I want to think now a little bit more about militarization, specifically the socialization of children into certain ways of thinking about conflict. And I wonder if this is a really good moment actually to ask you just to define the term militarization. What do you and other scholars mean by the militarization of childhood?
Sure. So I think probably important to define what we mean by militarization first. And here I'll turn to a couple of scholars who have thought really deeply about this and to whom I'm indebted and who offer a really clear and succinct way to understand it. The first is Laura Shepard, who describes militarism as a way of thinking about political issues that involves acceptance of the use of force and also the valorization of the military and military institutions. And those things are really deeply held, right? They're deeply held commitments that are difficult to place under challenge. I very much like and often cite Cynthia Enlow's description of militarism as driven down deep into the soil of society itself. And that gets at this sense of deeply held commitment. And so the militarization of childhood, then, it certainly includes placing children directly under arms, making child soldiers of them. That can be through warlordism, which maps with the popular iconography of the child soldier. It can also be JROTC, Junior Reserve Officer Training Programs in American schools, for instance, or cadet programs in my country, Canada, and elsewhere in the world, where children, sometimes as young as 10, in some cases younger than that, are brought into paramilitary arms of the state military itself. But it's also about how children, including children very far from zones of conflict, are socialized to militarism as that set of commitments and political predispositions that people like Laura Shepard and Cynthia Enlow talk about.
Absolutely. That sense that children are being socialized into particular habits of thinking, particular attitudes as well. In your edited volume, The Militarisation of Childhood, Thinking Beyond the Global South, and in some of your other work, you have called for much wider attention to be paid to the militarization of children beyond conflict zones, as you've just started to talk about there. And you write in the introduction to The Militarization of Childhood, without denying the continuing relevance of the child soldier literature, or that a great deal of important work remains to be done on the subject, it's also the case that there's much more to the militarization of childhood than readily comes to light through investigations that are enclosed by zones of conflict. What the literature does not yet sufficiently offer is reflection on the myriad ways in which the lives of children are militarized in advanced post-industrial societies. And I wonder if you can just explain a little bit more why that's important, why it's important that we pay attention to zones beyond conflict and the myriad ways in which the lives of children are militarized.
I think first and foremost, perhaps because militarism itself demands it, that is, demands attention to children. I think a really useful analogy to this is Cynthia Enlow's work on how militaries have invested a great deal in reaching mothers. And the reason that they do so, as she shows us, is that it turns out that the support of one's mother is one of the most important indicators in the likelihood of a young person, a young adult, opting to join the military. And particularly for the militaries of the advanced industrial and post-industrial countries of largely the global north, the level of professionalization involved in the use of advanced weapon systems, advanced information handling capabilities, and so forth, means that they can't rely on conscription to fill their ranks. And so they really do have to count on investing in strategies that help them reach willing participants, right? Volunteer recruits. And again, Enlow shows how mothers are really critically important in that. And that's perhaps a little counterintuitive for some folks, because if we think through the logics of it a little bit, what it means is that for countries like the United States, the most advanced military in the entire world, in fact, in world history, a critical element of the ability to wield force is reaching mothers. And so if militaries wouldn't be investing these resources, they wouldn't be going to this effort if it wasn't necessary for them to do so. And what's interesting is that militaries also invest a great deal in reaching children. So there are the cadet programs that I mentioned, the JROTC programs in American schools. There are equivalents in the UK and in many, many other countries. There are also the kinds of informal outreach that the military does, visiting schools. So my daughter was in the 9th grade. The Canadian military was at careers fair at her school, where young people at that age were already beginning to think about what they might do later in life. They show up at fairs. They're involved in different aspects of leisure activities and of popular culture. Sebastian Kampf and others have written extensively about the involvement of the US military in particular in cinema, right? In Hollywood, including okaying scripts. So there's an awful lot of effort that militaries are going to reach children and families more broadly in a wide range of different ways. That again, like what Enlow tells us about mothers, it's difficult to imagine militaries, particularly in times of fiscal restraint, because they do it through those moments also, would be investing those efforts if there wasn't something in it for them, if there wasn't some aspect of advancing what their sense is of their mission. And I would suggest that part of that is, and I don't mean to suggest anything necessarily nefarious about all of this, but part of that is inculcating a particular worldview. Firstly, about the military, obviously, and its place in society and in the world, but also of the necessity of it, right? So we hear tropes of protecting freedom, of guaranteeing security, of a dangerous world, all of which are part and parcel of these kinds of programs.
You sketched another really, really interesting picture there. As a mother, I'm obviously delighted by the research that suggests that my children will actually care what I think about whether or not they enlist in the military. That's encouraging. You've sketched a really interesting picture there of this quite conscious, quite deliberate militarization through all sorts of different means. So direct recruitment, indirect recruitment through reaching parents, influential family members, but also these leisure activities. We just had the Jubilee celebrations in the UK, and of course an awful lot of military display is part of that, which is part of national celebration. It's part of the tourist trail in London to watch the changing of the guard and so on. Air displays by air forces, whether for jubilees or for just sort of Saturday afternoons, all of those things that, as you say, I think the phrase I'm picking out from what you just said is this inculcating a particular worldview, a way of visualizing the world, which necessitates a form of militarized security in order to deal with bad actors and so on. So that's a very interesting picture that you've painted there of quite deliberate, quite focused militarization by militaries. But you and other contributors to the book that I've just mentioned, The Militarisation of Childhood, have also really drawn attention to the need to be aware of what you call everyday militarism. So the militarization of young people's minds that goes on in lots and lots of everyday practices, not actually coming directly from militaries themselves. And there's a whole spectrum of influences that are embedded in social structures, in culture, in ideology. I'm struck by the fact that, for example, lots of war metaphors were used for our response and for galvanizing also children's responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, for example. So I wonder if you can just talk us through a few concrete examples of so-called everyday militarism, just to help listeners think a little bit more about these indirect, even maybe subconscious forms of militarization that children experience as they grow up.
Sure. I think COVID is a really great example of how war metaphor permeates everyday life. We see, though, what I was talking about with respect to military's outreach and involvement in children's programming, in some senses, that's the low-hanging fruit of militarization of the lives of children, especially far from the conflict zone. War metaphor is one thing. Cinema is another. A lot of attention has been paid, of course, to things like toys and in particular video games. These have probably drawn the most attention in that they can be so conspicuously militarized. I find it useful to think of all of these things and a lot more of what exists as part of children's everyday as pedagogical. So when we think of pedagogy, we're probably inclined to think first of formal instruction, right? Schools, of course, curriculum. There's also other programmatic learning that takes place on field trips, perhaps at museums, even leisure activities that have an explicit pedagogical mission. A lot of military and war museums offer summer camps with an explicit educational focus. There is a Cold War era bunker outside of Ottawa that was supposed to have seen the Canadian government through global thermonuclear war that hosts summer day camps for children. But there are all sorts of other examples of this. These are things that teach not only the underlying values and assumptions of militarism, but they teach also in the sense that they contribute to normalizing and naturalizing it by making these children's spaces and in the ways that they bring it into children's everyday life worlds. So normalized by, among other things, the encoded assumption that war play is appropriate to children's socialization. The Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, and I recognize I'm using a lot of Canadian museums, but I've been doing a lot of research in these spaces of late, but certainly there are others like it, hosts children's birthday parties. They also host sleepovers in a gallery that houses armor from the First World War through the Second World War, the Korean War, right up to the present day, or at least through the Cold War years and immediate post-Cold War era. And so the idea that these are appropriate places to children's leisure is normalizing these, to be blunt, killing machines, right? This is a gallery filled with tanks, with artillery. There is a warplane that dominates in the upper portion of the gallery as well. At the same time, they naturalize in the way that they really inure children to the idea of organized violence as an expected and frequently respected way to resolve at least some political problems. Toys and video games also educate as to good war and bad war, good conduct, bad conduct, good weapons and bad weapons. And of course, the good guys and the bad guys. And the subject positions in these contexts are overwhelmingly gendered masculine. We can think of the example perhaps of happening upon someone playing a war-themed video game, a first-person shooter in a combat kind of genre. In that encounter, we can see how particular kinds of weapons come to be valued, how particular ways of war as well come to be valued, and also setting up of a hierarchy of subject positions in conflict, the good guys and the bad guys, as it were. So if you've ever encountered this, if you've watched someone play, or even if you just go and look on YouTube for examples of it, there can be something as simple as a little bit of indecipherable telemetry going on down in the corner of the screen. And it doesn't have to make sense to the player or certainly to the spectator for us to recognize right away that this is the aesthetic of the perspective of the good guys, right? We're now seeing through the eyes of those possessed of the advanced weapons technology. Perhaps the aesthetic includes that kind of gray-grain hue of looking through night vision goggles. All of this isn't intelligible just in that moment alone, but in myriad encounters that children and we as adults also have had, where we have learned, we've developed the social competencies to be able to decode these kinds of signals. And so though the theme of the combat video game might seem to be the explicitly militarized aspect of it. There are these other kinds of subtler articulations going on as well that bring with them meaning that's been made in other kinds of encounters, perhaps in cinema, what have you, so that the game developers or the filmmakers can count on us having arrived with the social competencies necessary to make sense of these different subject positions in those ways.
And your answer there, Marshall, has really drawn attention to the multiple reinforcing factors that children from an incredibly young age grow up with and are influenced by, which ultimately results in some kind of military literacy, which, as you say, enables them to decode the military narratives that they encounter in all sorts of different media, lots of different media, cinema, film, gaming, museum spaces, and so on. I'm really interested in what you've said, the way in which a museum trailer or a museum sleepover teaches the values of militarism, but fundamentally is teaching things like the just war tradition without explicitly teaching the just war tradition. So teaching these worldviews about good forms of war, bad forms of war, and so on. And I think also presumably teaching children about their personal responses, their personal responsibilities as well. I was struck by one chapter by Claire Turin-Soliander in your book, The Militarisation of Childhood, that actually sort of goes through her personal experience of being involved in a school shooting when she was 16, and the way in which she understood that lots of militarised assumptions about agency and responsibility were expressed in the kind of the community response and the community healing that followed. Militarized assumptions that valorized stoicism, forbade trauma almost, and encouraged a kind of business as usual reaction. And so she talks about that as part, in a sense, of the militarization of childhood. So I wonder if you can maybe respond to that a little bit and just talk us through a little bit more these sort of the impacts and the implications for children and young people and the adults they become of these everyday militarisms.
Claire's chapter is really powerful about her experience in the school shooting. And I think there is a certain comportment as well that goes with militarism that we might call stoicism. It sometimes is cult of heroics. It can be the urge to be resilient. And so militarism can demand this of civilian populations as well. And so I think if I were limited to one word that I could use in thinking of how militarism affects other subjects and what it demands of them, I think the word would be enlistment. And that can be quite literal. Again, JROTC, cadets, even appealing to the future adult recruit by inculcating values in the present child. In the big picture, though, militarism usually relies on a relatively small number of direct recruits to the military itself and a very large number of others who were socialized to it to the extent necessary to countenance its consumption of vast sums of resources, of national treasure, if you will, including in ostensible peacetime, because war preparation, after all, is a demand underwritten by an expectation of persistent danger, which really is one of the ontologies of militarism, one of the fundamental is statements about the world, an assumption that it relies on. And of course, at times, it also takes a terrible toll in blood as well as treasure. Societies sometimes withhold or withdraw consent to bearing those costs. One thinks of the importance of the anti-war movement in the US during the Vietnam War, for instance, or examples in which public opposition has been strong enough to force the cancellation of this or that overambitious arms procurement program. And so militarism, therefore, turns to a very great extent on the enlistment of society to accepting its enabling values and its ideational commitments. And so when I speak of enlistment, it's with that in mind. Again, going to Cynthia Enlow, as she points out, most militarized people are not soldiers. They're not in uniform, as she puts it. They're civilians. And so the kinds of things that you're getting at in your question, I would turn to the cult of heroics here as a form of enlistment. Enlisting children, not just in trying to appeal to them to want to be the hero, but enlisting them in reproducing these ideas about the hero, which relies on some social disciplining. And Alison Howell has written about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, amongst veterans, combat veterans, and how veterans are required to do the work of being resilient. And in being resilient, they help to facilitate militarism by helping to make some of its pathological effects disappear from public view. And so to be heroic is, among other things, not to experience trauma. It's to face danger bravely and without complaint. It's to be stoic, as is called upon children in recovering from the example of a school shooting that Claire Scholander talks about. I think there are other senses, too, in which we can actually get a little closer to the military and still see how children very far from zones of conflict are quasi-enlisted. And I'm thinking of children of military families and the special demands that their parents' military service places on them. So there's significant research to show that, well, there are, of course, benefits to being a child of a military family, exposed to lots of different things, right? Different opportunities, moving frequently. Children of military families tend to experience food insecurity at a higher rate than their non-military family peers. And there are all sorts of other kinds of effects. Of course, there can be fear or worry for a parent deployed. In cases where both parents are in the military, they might be without either or both parents for significant lengths of time. And so there is a cult of resilience as well that operates amongst children in military families. In the US context, there's something called the Military Child of the Year Award that Michelle Obama was a great proponent of. And while it is important to recognize young people's exceptional achievements, there's also a sense in which centering this in the military context, and that the Military Child of the Year Awards are really explicit about wanting to recognize excellence in spite of all of the risks that these children are placed at for their parents' military membership, is that it underscores the importance to the military of them doing the work of being resilient, of not letting it affect them. Because of course, if it's affecting them, it's going to affect their parents' operational readiness, right? Their focus on a mission and so forth. And so there's a lot of unseen work that gets done by children to make militarism possible in the first place. And it turns on things like resilience, like a cult of heroics and more.
That's really fascinating, this idea that children are enlisted to do the work of militarism in those contexts that you've talked about. There's so much I'd like to pull out of what you've just said. I think one of the things I found really fascinating by it is that by training, I'm an ancient historian, and I'm very used to characterizing the ancient world, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, as much more militarized societies than today, with a far higher percentage of people who directly experience conflict, fought as soldiers or were family members of people who fought as soldiers. And what you've just said has actually made me rethink and question that assumption that I've got, because you've drawn attention to the ways in which the cult of heroics, as you put it, continues to prevail very, very strongly, but in quite unobserved, quite invisible, not very scrutinized ways. This enlistment of society that happens sort of under the radar and starts so very young. And, you made a point there about one of the things that it achieves, perhaps is designed to achieve or achieves even without design, is this countenancing of huge amounts of military spending. We know that there's very, very little spending relatively on peace building. And that really brings me to my next question. As you know, we had the wonderful Helen Berrence on our podcast last month, someone you've collaborated with a lot. And she talked to us about the benefits and the challenges of including young people in peace building processes. And I know you've written about this yourself. One of your recent publications is an edited volume, Childhood in Peace and Conflict. And several chapters in that book look at the issue of child participation in peace building. And children's participation is determined, obviously, by lots of factors. And we're going to come on to some of those in a minute. But first, I just wanted to ask you if you think there are any or many equivalencies on the peace side of what you've just talked to us about the militarization of childhood. I'm thinking, for example, young children might get taught conflict resolution skills with their friends in school. They're taught about civil or constructive ways to debate. Could we see that as them being socialized as potential peace builders? And does that happen to the extent that they are militarized by social structures and practices and cultures and ideologies as you've sketched just now?
So I think I have two responses to that, though they're related. The first is that I think that, yes, these are important moments of socialization as well, but in my estimation, they're overwhelmed by what in work that I'm doing now I've taken to calling militarism's ambient cacophony. Militarism is always there, beating drums in the background, and sometimes in ways much less conspicuous than a beating drum. And so, though I think these are, of course, very important moments, I'm not sure that they are able to overwhelm. So, if we think, for instance, of conflict resolution strategies and those sorts of things being made part of curricula, which they are, war remembrance is also an important part of curriculum, and particular ways of being in relation to war remembrance as well. So I think that the everyday of militarism, and I can speak to that in some maybe different ways, less connected to the school setting, but I think that it is the context within which meaning is made of so many of these other things. The second answer I would have to it is, in light of this cacophony of militarist ideation, practice, and performance that is incessant, not just in the lives of children, but if we know how to look for it in the lives of us all, that children's unique social disempowerment is a further problem. So if we think, for instance, of anti-bullying strategies, which might be thought of as a kind of peace building, there has traditionally been the problem of the bully and the bullied. And in recent years, there's been an emphasis placed with children in school curricula in many places on emphasizing the role of the bystander, that the bystander can intervene and disempower the bully. The problem is, children are, in essence, being asked to do the work of peacemaking, where they lack the social power to be able to change the structures of conflict. And so, if this is what's going on in the schoolyard, there is the danger that empowering children in rhetoric, but not in reality, in terms of their social location, deactivates the responsibility of the adults who do possess social power to intervene. And there have been examples cited, it's anecdotal, of children not being able to draw adults' attention in these moments and later being criticized for not having intervened. So there's quite a bit of risk here, I think, of losing sight in the quite laudable effort to recapture children's agency and to see them as meaningful social actors in their own right, which they are, of slipping into a kind of liberal presumption of equality, that somehow the differential power relations in society for a moment here don't matter, and that children therefore are responsibilized. And I think of that in connection with what I was saying earlier about children of military families, how they in effect become responsibilized to be resilient instead of the institutions of militarism, or perhaps even their parents, but I'm thinking more of the military itself, being responsible, if not to prevent them being exposed to the kinds of pathological effects that they are, at least to take responsibility for their remediation. And so I think bringing it back to the first point, that where militarism is so ubiquitous in children's lives, and including in very subtle circulations sometimes that might be less obvious until we start to dig down deeper, I'm not sure that in light of children's disempowerment, they're in a position to remake the social worlds in a way that we might hope.
Really, really interesting. And I think we're going to dig more into agency a little bit in a minute, but those very important points about understanding children's disempowerment, understanding the sort of power inequalities and the risks of making them feel or making them in reality somehow responsible for peace building at a very, very local, small level like bullying, or at a much larger level, is important to be aware of. You mentioned, I think, a phrase, ways of being in relation to war remembrance in that conversation, which reminded me of a chapter in your book, Childhoods in Peace and Conflict by Susanna Wright, which looks at the ways in which children are being taught certain ways of being around commemoration in respect to Armistice Day in particular. And I think the point of her chapter is really that children are understood as very important audiences of the main message that gets articulated through commemorations like Armistice Day. and the message being to remember and to honor the lives lost during conflict, and so on. But alongside that, there's this assumption that she's observed in the curation of these commemoration events, that children are also understood as potentially peace builders, or at least internationalists of the future, as agents in the future. So they're neglected as political subjects in their present time. Their lack of agency as children is acknowledged, but there's an assumption that in future they will be able to act as capable, productive adults, as I think she says, who will preserve international peace in a way that hadn't been prior to World War I, for example. And I think that's a really fascinating observation there about the agency which adults are willing to cede to children for the future, for when they're adults, and that kind of responsibility that's perhaps put on the future adult that the child is now. Is that something that you've come across yourself, or that you want to comment on in relation to children's agency?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, imagined childhood, the idea of childhood that has been so effectively critiqued in critical childhood studies in recent decades. Childhood as defined by incapacity relative to adult subjects, where social participation and autonomy, even bodily autonomy, are held in deferment until some presumed threshold to competency in ascension to adulthood. These sorts of things, they operate in the realm of intersubjectivity, in that they are kind of shared ideas. I would say, too, they're common senses about children that we fall back into too easily. But sovereign power knows better. Sovereign power operates in ways that Susanna's chapter brings to light in anticipating the future adult and the roles that are marked out for that adult. But in times of emergency, sovereign power recognizes very, very quickly important work that children do in the here and now. So when I say the important work, well, we think of child soldiers. It's that, again, prepubescent sub-Saharan African boy that we think of doing the work of political conflict, right? It's a form of work. But there is the analog in the developed North, the privileged North, of the relatively privileged child, that is relative to the child of the South in that other context, also being relied upon to do important work, without which militarism would not function as it does. So that might be deferring to a cult of heroics. It might be being resilient. It might be internalizing all sorts of enabling knowledges of militarism, such as the idea of the ubiquity of threat. There is also, when we think of child labor, and that tends to be what we imagine in troubled places of the South, in the ways that we typically talk about it, a great deal of labor being done in the North by children, without which everyday life couldn't be replicated. So children who are responsible for elder care in their homes, or for the care of younger siblings in order that a parent or parents can go out to work, particularly in situations of single parent-headed households or of poverty, where parents have to be out of the home a great deal of the time. Domestic reproduction is not possible in the absence of this labor. Children provide labor in a host of other ways that society relies upon. And so the waged economy is predicated on the unwaged work of women, as feminists have long pointed out, but also increasingly of children, and perhaps more increasingly visibly, but I suspect increasingly also in an economy that is predicated on more precarious labor by adults. This brings us then to these moments of emergency. In times of war, including in the global North, sovereign power has turned to children as soldiers, sometimes directly enlisting them, sometimes simply turning a blind eye when they lie about their age in order to enlist before the age of 18. And though we think of child soldiers as being indicative of the guileful or nefarious person of some warlord or other unscrupulous kind of figure of the adult world, when we talk about those who lied about their age to serve in the trenches of the First World War, for instance, there's a kind of reflective romanticism about it, including in the North. As well, children were relied upon in both world wars to fill the places left in munitions factories or in farms, on farms, in the fields, in food production, on both sides of the conflict. through the Cold War, they were relied upon in various ways. In the context of the Red Scare, there were direct appeals to children to assume responsibility for policing their social worlds. Under COVID-19, a number of states made direct appeals to children. What were particularly interesting were the leaders of New Zealand, Denmark, Canada, a couple of others, some US states, who held special press conferences appealing directly to children. And these weren't, as you might expect, simply about trying to quell what one might imagine would be the fears of young children in an uncertain time. These leaders were asking things of these young people. They were asking for them to participate in various ways in pandemic mitigation. In some instances, to think of ways that they might produce personal protective equipment that could be used for healthcare workers in the early days of the pandemic when there were shortages. In one or two instances, being asked to engage in social surveillance, and that is to report those who weren't following pandemic protocols. In the case of the Chief Medical Officer of Health in Canada, Dr. Theresa Tam, asking that children keep track of the contacts by members of their family in the event that pandemic surveillance needs to turn to that later in contact tracing. That wasn't a specific request made by Dr. Tam of adults in the regular press conference. And so sovereign power recognizes the indispensability of children in moments of crisis and is willing to suspend the norms of the governance of children in those moments.
And it's a very sobering set of thoughts that you've just presented us with there, because there's a fundamental paradox, isn't there, or sort of a clash between assumptions that we're living in an age where the rights of the child are more protected than ever, and yet you've just painted a picture of a largely invisible but very significant body of child labour in many different sectors, many different areas, that is doing the work of adults, doing work that's demanded of them by their sovereign state. The COVID-19 pandemic is that excellent example. Not only were children asked to do work, but they were asked to think of themselves as heroes. So once again, we've got the cult of the hero coming in there. In times of crisis, really leveraging latent militarisms, among other things, and putting children to certain kinds of work. So that really does dispel some of the ideals that we might have come to this podcast with about childhood as a sort of an idyllic time, at least for privileged children largely in the global north. But I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit more about the imagined child. In the introduction to your book, Discovering Childhood in International Relations, you talk about the philosopher Peter Singer's drowning child. And I wonder if you could just talk listeners through that as a way of explaining a little bit more what you mean by the imagined child or imagined childhood, the idealization we often have of childhood, but also what childhood comes to symbolize in political contexts and in society generally.
Sure. So what Singer does in this thought experiment that he describes having offered to his students is propose to them a scenario wherein on their way to class, they pass by a pond where a small child is drowning, and they're faced with a choice. They can rescue the child and soak their clothes and be late to class, or they can forsake the child's life and be in class on time in dry clothes. And in asking them what would be the appropriate choice, not surprisingly, there is unanimity that, of course, they would all save the child. And my comment on that in the book that you mentioned is that what's interesting about the scenario is that we know nothing at all about the child except the ascription child. We know nothing about age, race, gender, ability, any other thing, because we don't need to know anything else for the purposes of Singer's thought experiment. What we need to know is that it's the child. And that's because childhood, in the way I think about it, operates in ways very similar to gender or race or other categories of identity and difference. And so the imagined child is that one I spoke of earlier, who is defined by incapacity, by innocence and vulnerability. And of course, in reality, children do lack certain capacities. but so too do adults. And particular children have certain capacities that some other children don't. So too adults. The child, though, is immediately recognizable as encoding this kind of innocence and vulnerability, and therefore an obligation to save them. And Singer relies in this thought experiment on us bringing exactly that view of childhood. It's why nothing more is said to us about the child. We don't need to know whether the child did something foolish and maybe deserves their fate. That's unthinkable. The fact of child is enough to know that rescue is, of course, imperative. I think it's telling that Singer doesn't simply say a drowning person, because the thought experiment is able to trade on the expectation that nobody is going to say they wouldn't rescue a child. And I think we see this in other ways, in other places too. Something I've recently written about and have done quite a bit of hand-wringing about for a few years is a film you might have seen called Eye in the Sky. And I won't be a spoiler and give anything away about the film because the premise is apparent in the earliest scenes. But it's that there are terrorists who are to be targeted by a drone. There's the threat that these terrorists will kill a good many people, some 80 is expected, if they're able to finish putting together the bomb that they're assembling. And so the drone strike is called when a young child, a girl, 8 or 9 years old, I believe she's supposed to be, walks into the blast radius of the weapon. And so the film plays out this kind of moral dilemma about whether the life of one child is worth more than a projected 80 innocent civilians who might be killed if these terrorists are able to see through their plan. What's interesting about this is that it has real life analogs. Childhood is really important as a meaning-making device in this film, and the filmmakers count on us bringing the social competencies requisite to seeing this child, Aaliyah, as unequivocally an innocent victim. She's not the only child in the film, but she's the only young girl, at least the only young girl with a speaking part. And that she is imperiled is what makes the whole premise of the movie work. In 2010, a notorious drone strike on 2 vehicles loaded with civilians traveling through Uruzgan province in Afghanistan played out in a kind of analogous way. For several hours, the drone pilot in Creech Air Force Base outside Las Vegas, Nevada, and threat assessors in Florida, and others who were in the loop from Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, all followed this vehicle trying to determine if there were children in the group. And if there were children, how could those children be defined? Ultimately, it was decided that there were no children, and the strike was carried out. And very shortly thereafter, the presence of children amongst those who had been killed or wounded became apparent. It resulted in an investigation carried out by the US military by orders of the Supreme Commander in Afghanistan, General McChrystal. And ultimately, the transcripts were made public of the discussions that took place amongst the drone pilot and the threat assessors, the screeners. The deliberations that took place around how and whether they could eliminate not just the possibility of children being present in order that they could carry out this strike, but also the possibility of some people being children. Sarah Shoker has written a very important book on how targets in drone strikes are constituted and the idea of the military-aged male. Childhood is important here because military-aged male. So childhood is intersecting gender. It turned out that some of the screeners felt that a military-aged male might be a boy 13 or over, perhaps 12 or over. One defined an adolescent as perhaps as young as 7, but they were in agreement that a military-aged male is a dangerous combatant. And so in order to be able to carry out the strike and identify some of these civilians as combatants, they in essence had to evacuate some children from childhood. It says something, as does what the filmmakers count on us bringing to the film eye in the sky in the way of social competencies about the power of childhood as a political resource, but also as an arbiter of legitimately and illegitimately produced violence.
And what you've just sketched there, the contrast between the idealization and the protectionist discourses for the child in the film Eye in the Sky, and the discussions about evacuating, as you say, evacuating certain young people from the category childhood in that real life example in Afghanistan, really underline an extraordinary paradox, which is that we have strong assumptions around imagined childhood, around childhood as a concept, and we attach all sorts of ideas to childhood as a concept, but it becomes a manipulable concept as well, something that we can change the parameters of for different contexts. So it's not this stable concept, it's a concept that evolves for political pragmatism at times. Again, lots of incredibly interesting things there that I could pull out. But I suppose what I want to do is just move from these ideas that circulate about childhood as defined by incapacity, innocence, vulnerability, but only certain kinds of children and certain kinds of childhood in certain kinds of contexts. Just think about how that then impacts on the way in which children are viewed as political subjects themselves in different contexts. So you've just given us an example of, how you might define a military-aged male, but thinking about perhaps less militarized contexts as well of political subjecthood. How do children and childhood intersect with politics through these ideas that we have of the expectations that we have around children and childhood?
Well, I think children's agency is perhaps less in question than children's subjecthood. So the way that I make the distinction is that if agency is the capacity to act, children clearly have that. This is reflected in all sorts of ways. For instance, the need to regulate children's behavior in the first place. Of course, they're social actors. We recognize that. It's why we set rules for them. It's why childhood is so regulated by state, by parents, and in other kinds of ways as well. The figure of the child soldier, obviously agential. It's what makes the child soldier so frightening. If the child soldier wasn't agential, then there wouldn't be a lot to be concerned about in terms of the violences that the child soldier might do. There would have still, of course, be those that they suffer. Subjecthood is different in the way I understand it. If being an agent is having the capacity to act, being a subject or being possessed of subjecthood is in some sense being the author of one's actions. So the child soldier typically isn't understood that way, right? We see their agency, we don't see their subjecthood, we impute that instead to the warlord, right? The warlord who has by force put them under arms or by manipulation put them under arms. And there is a literature, a subset of the literature on child soldiers that looks at recovering children's subjecthood, even in the case of child soldiering, where many children, in fact, voluntarily become child soldiers as a recent survival strategy under conditions that are abject. And so there is something of subjecthood operating there. Now, we would say, of course, I would absolutely agree that this is a case of that subjecthood being strongly conditioned by structural circumstances that are beyond the child's remit. But that is the case for many adults in the world too. I mean, it's the case for all of us to some extent or another, more so in cases of conflict, crisis, or acute deprivation. Yet we don't erase the subjecthood of adults the same way. In fact, in many instances, we're less inclined to see the structural determinants of adults' choices at all, particularly when we disagree with the choices that they make and wish to hold them responsible. Again, what thinking about childhood in the way that we would think about race or about gender offers us is the ability to start to unpack some of these things and to find children as important, effectual, and to some degree, autonomous social actors in the same way that everyone, to greater or lesser extents, is somewhat only autonomous as a social actor.
So this question of autonomy is really interesting in making that important distinction between agency and subjecthood. And what you've just said there helps us think about sort of blurred boundaries between childhood and adulthood, whereas for all sorts of reasons, and many of them protectionist and good reasons, we have in many cultures really wanted to make very sharp distinctions between childhood responsibility and adulthood responsibility. But of course, that can be very protective. It means that the age of criminal responsibility, for example, is, it's an important principle in many societies that you set the age of criminal responsibility relatively high, and you're not making children responsible for decisions that you might make them responsible for as adults. But of course, the flip side of it is that you don't cede children power, autonomy in other contexts of political decision making. I wonder if you can just talk us through a little bit more about those implications. So in some of your recent work, you have written about childhood as a technology of governance. I wonder if you can explain a bit what you mean by that and what implications it has for understanding the limitations that are often placed on children's participation in politics, among other things.
So this goes to what I was saying about understanding childhood the way I would understand race or gender. And in the most obvious sense, imagined childhood, so childhood as an idea, analogous to race or gender, functions as a governance technology in the way that the lives of children themselves are governed. So some of the examples you just gave, the age at which we hold someone criminally responsible, for instance, but also the age at which we permit them bodily autonomy, the extent to which we permit them social or political participation, rather than holding that in deferment, though typically it is held in deferment, licensing to drive a motor vehicle. They could serve on juries, perhaps at a later date than being held criminally responsible. So there's some indeterminacy about all of this as well. In many contexts, young people are eligible to join militaries before they're eligible to vote or to drink alcohol. And so there's a lot of indeterminacy about all of this that I think points to the indeterminacy of childhood as an idea itself. Now, feminists have been very good at pointing up to us the socially constructed nature of gender, all of its indeterminacies and contingencies. Likewise, critical race theorists on race. We're not there yet with childhood. Childhood still really resides in that intersubjective world of common senses, where the dominant understanding of it, the falsity of that dominant understanding, seems unthinkable to a great many people. And the habits of thought, but also habits of practice and performance that we easily fall back into around that. But I think there's another sense in which childhood operates as a technology of governance. And I'll maybe go back to the example of the film Eye in the Sky. One of the things that happens in the course of that movie is that the child, Aaliyah, wanders in and out of the projected blast radius of the weapon that is to be launched from the drone against the terrorists. This is a precision-guided weapon, and that means that it is expected to reliably arrive at a certain point in space and have a definable, more or less, radius of destructive effect. These weapons have become really important to the production of legitimacy and the wielding of political violence ever since particularly the 1991 Gulf War, when much was made of the idea of smart bombs and surgical strikes and all these other things entered the popular lexicon, notwithstanding that, as many folks have pointed out, in fact, very little in the way of the armaments that were used in that war by the US and its coalition partners were actually precision guided at all. Most were ordinary dumb bombs with all of the pernicious effects of those. But what was new was this rhetoric of precision. It quickly became a really important element of the claim, not just to legitimacy in wielding political violence, but in fact, a monopoly on that legitimacy in the ways that it was right back then in 1991 already carefully juxtaposed with claims about the inherent indiscriminacy of the practices of the other side. And of course, we've seen this in conflicts ever since, including in the war that's going on in Ukraine, that the claim to be able to precisely target combatants while not imperiling non-combatants is really important to the ability to effectively use advanced arms technology in the first place. In a sense, the film Eye in the Sky, drawing on what we know, right? We, the audience, what we know and what the filmmakers can count on us knowing about childhood, turns all of that on its head, because the child wandering in or out of the blast zone alternatingly makes that weapon more or less precise in a practical sense. When the child is outside the projected blast zone, when Aaliyah wanders far enough away, the weapon is precise enough to do what it's supposed to do in a way that is unquestionably legitimate, or at least so the film presents it. When she wanders too close, all of a sudden the weapon is too blunt an instrument to do this violent work anymore. The same thing can be seen in a different sense in the Uruzgan drone strike, where trying to define some of the children out of childhood by assessing them to be perhaps old enough to be considered a military-aged male means that the weapon becomes precise enough to do its work there too. So in a practical sense, if not a real material sense, the properties of the weapon itself are affected by this. So I think this really points up how it is that childhood as an idea, imagine childhood, manifests as a really important social technology, also in the governance of armed conflict. I mentioned Omran Daknish, the boy in the back of the ambulance in Aleppo in 2016. When those pictures came to light, the Syrian regime was at great pains to debunk the narrative that emerged around it of Omran Daknish as a victim of the attack by the regime or perhaps by its Russian allies. And so when sovereign power gets so exercised about the narrative that emerges around an image like that, it tells us something about the political possibilities that, as Helen Barents has pointed up in her work, are variously opened or foreclosed by these kinds of images.
Really fascinating, this idea that childhood becomes, that the imagined childhood, ideas of childhood become this influence on governance, this factor that shapes governance in armed conflict, but governance more generally. And you've spoken there about this indeterminacy of childhood, the socially constructed nature of childhood. And despite the fact that we can see ways in which it's socially constructed, there's this sort of deep ingrained habit. Also understanding childhood as something that just everyone understands, and therefore we don't interrogate it too much. We don't look as closely at it and as closely at its use in society as we might. So your work on political subjecthood and childhood and how they intersect has been drawing our attention very importantly to the ways in which children are imagined, but also boxed in, limited, and then potentially exploited in political and indeed military spaces. But I know that your work has also looked at ways in which they might actually participate as agents, but also as subjects in socio-political life, and how we can then take them seriously as bona fide political actors, not just as passive objects of adult politics and adult visualization. So I wonder if you can just talk us through a bit about what does it take to do this, to take children seriously as subjects, not just agents, and where can it lead? What are the payoffs?
On this, I would turn not to suggest something of a panacea or that this does all of the work that's necessary, but rather as an exemplar of a way that we might start to approach children differently as meaningful social actors, as participants in the social worlds that we share. I've been really very interested in an emergent concept of the children's university in the last decade or so. And they've been increasingly popular in a number of places. They began largely as sort of weekend, perhaps Saturday morning lecture series for children run by universities. And in some places, though, they've been quite different. There's a program in Hawaii called Napua No'eo for Native Hawaiian children specifically. There are others as well, including one that I'm involved with at McMaster University, where we have made as our central ethos, as does the Hawaiian program and some others, the idea of engaging children as already bearers and producers of knowledge. In other words, though we have as one component, and I'll just use the McMaster example because it's the one that I'm most involved with and therefore most familiar with. We do have a Saturday morning lecture series, but there are also different kinds of events that include work in the community. And in all of these, the aim is not so much to convey a particular subject matter, though that's a part of it. I see that in some ways as almost the hook to get attention. So if I take the lecture series as an example, there are 8 lectures or 10 lectures in some cases, different places a year. And at McMaster, we might have one presented by someone from the humanities, another month it's someone from engineering. And so all the faculties on campus participate. But the idea and what we ask of those who give these presentations, as well as those who give presentations in the community and who work with the community, is that they work from their current research. So they're not going in to teach. The idea isn't to instruct on something, but rather to share the kinds of curiosities that they're currently exploring, the questions that they have, and not just to talk the whole time, but to engage these children. So we have children as young, sometimes as 4 or 5, as old as 16 or 17, but the typical age is probably somewhere between about 7 and 13 for most. And the advice that we give to lecturers is don't dumb it down. Don't talk down to them. Don't go in thinking this is a child audience, so I have to make it simple. Of course, they have to jettison the specialized language. We all have to do that. If a political scientist speaks to a biomedical engineer, they might both have PhDs, but they still have to set aside their specialized disciplinary language in order to discuss their research. That doesn't mean they have to dumb down the ideas. Those who take us seriously, and most do, find that the level of engagement of these young people is wherever they care to pitch it. And in fact, if they pitch it down too low, they lose the children. They stop paying attention. And this ethos turns on a view that while expert knowledge is one important kind of knowledge, it's not only not the only one, it's also not without its limitations. So expert knowledge, another way of putting it, is to say that it's discipline knowledge. We've all spent a great many years in our fields. By the time we have a PhD, we know the contours of our discipline. We know what are the right questions to ask. We know what are the disciplinary concerns. We are disciplined, to put it plainly. And one of the things that discipline does is it starts to wall off particular kinds of questions. Because we have our disciplinary habits of thought, we don't think sometimes, it doesn't occur to us to ask questions, to push curiosities that might seem, if I can put it this way, heretical to the disciplinary ear. Children, on the other hand, when we engage with them around knowledge, they are first and foremost already bearers of knowledge, of course. They are experts in their own daily lives. They have their own experiences, some of them experiences of conflict, some of participation in different kinds of ways. Some might have experiences with the healthcare system that a researcher on health policy would like to access and cannot. So they are bearers of knowledge. And we recognize that as researchers across a whole host of fields in the ways that we turn to them as such. We don't as readily see them as producers of knowledge. And yet they come without the disciplined habits of thought so that they ask the heretical questions, not knowing they're heretical. And one of the things that we have found is that those amongst our colleagues from across faculties who have presented in this lecture series, a good many of them have said later, I had never thought of X until that young person asked that question. Because the young people don't know not to ask the heretical questions, and their curiosities range beyond the bounds of our disciplines. And so if we start to see them as potentially partners in knowledge production, which is not to degrade the importance of the expert knowledge. I mean, some of us have pursued PhDs because we do think that there is an importance to it, but we shouldn't imagine the sufficiency of it. And so the ethos that I'm speaking of is one in which I see the Children's University as a kind of engaged form of rights education. So while the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, most famously in Article 12, but in other places as well, speaks to children's right of participation and also mandates that there be rights education, often the rights education that takes place for children in school curricula kind of undermines its own message in that it is a monological form of imparting knowledge about something. It's a unit in the curriculum, as opposed to something that children can actually come to engage in. And once they're past the unit, it may or may not ever be spoken about again. The model of the children's university, and it's one that I think can be replicated elsewhere in everyday life as well, is one where children are becoming socialized in these encounters to seeing themselves as bona fide bearers and producers of knowledge. Now, it doesn't mean that every question that a child raises is going to lead somewhere. And so we have to work as well to make sure that the question that doesn't isn't going to be, it's not going to undermine the child's enthusiasm to continue participating. And one of the things that a colleague of mine who is a researcher in pediatrics, he's the director of the McMaster Children and Youth University, Dr. Sandeep Raha, what he has talked about is how in his lab, he has to say the same thing with doctoral researchers, right? Has to remind them that that thing you spent X amount of time researching that turned out to be a dead end is not actually a loss. It's not actually a waste, because until you went down the dead end, you didn't know that that's what it was. And so it too is now knowledge that we didn't have previously. And so trying to excite children about their ability to participate in knowledge production, knowing that it doesn't always lead to the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, is, I think, signals the kinds of ways that we might approach this. It means taking a more dialogical and less monological approach with young people, and recognizing at the same time that beyond the monological and the dialogical, there's also polyphonic dimension to young people's lives in that they're engaged in other conversations, in other encounters, including with militarisms and other things, where meaning is being made for them through the sum of encounters in their daily lives.
It's really great to hear about the McMaster University and the other versions of that are starting to spread a little bit around the world. And what the picture that you've just painted there shows the way in which taking children seriously as potential producers of knowledge, not just bearers of knowledge, can break down assumptions that adults have of them, but also break down assumptions or change assumptions or shape assumptions that children might have of themselves, socializing them into seeing themselves as producers of knowledge, as experts in certain contexts and certain ways. I love this idea that children ask heretical questions. Absolutely, they do. And what you said echoes very much with my quite limited experience so far of talking to very young children about war and peace, and really going into a workshop, for example, that I recently ran on visualizing peace for young children. There was sort of a bunch of 7 and 8 year olds, and I didn't deliver any content myself, and it felt very unnatural in a way doing that. But I wanted to know, what does peace smell like to you? What does it look like? What colors does peace have? What sounds do you associate with peace? And so on. They immediately started teaching me things I didn't know. One of the things that it sort of emerged very, very quickly was that whereas many adults think of peace as a binary with war and peace as the absence of conflict, they think of peace as fun, really fun. And it doesn't have to be quiet. It could be, going to a theme park, or it can be rolling around on the floor with your dog. And it was really fascinating just listening to them talk amongst themselves and learn from each other as well, and shape their ideas about peace. So you've given us one way in which children's subjecthood, not just agency, might be taken seriously. And through that, assumptions about childhood and about children, about their vulnerability, their incapacity, and so on, might be broken down for them as much as for us. And, in all sorts of publications, as we've said, you've called for different approaches to childhood in your practice as well. So I suppose one question that I'm wanting to ask you as we kind of wrap things up is, where do you see things going over the next decade or so? Do you think we're on the cusp of a potential turn in scholarship and practice, which will rethink children and childhood, which will apply some of what we've learned about how you think about gender, how we think about race, so that children are both protected but also empowered? Or are we still a very long way off from that? Where do you see things going?
I think we're still a long way off from it on gender and on race and on other things. And I think that in my view anyway, while there is lots of important and encouraging stuff going on, we have to not make the mistake of thinking in terms of a place that we'll get to, where it will all be okay. Childhood, like gender, like race, is practiced and performed. It has important political currency as a resource. And so I don't see us transcending the kind of worst aspects of the kinds of things that I've been talking about. But I do have hope that, as with race, as with gender, though we've a lot of work to do, and those struggles are not over, nor do I frankly expect them to be, I think we are getting better, perhaps, or at least are better positioned to begin to see some of these things. I think that with childhood, one of the things that's a bit different about it is how we still assume that it only applies to the child. Feminists have made very clear for a great many years that feminism is not just about women. Otherwise, as Lucia Irigaray has pointed out, we set up men as the kind of ideal type. And we need to understand gender as multiple, beyond binary, but also that there is this kind of power-infused sense that operates out there of gender as a binary, wherein there is an ideal type, where, as Irigaray and others have pointed out, often the feminine is seen as a divergence from the ideal type of the masculine. Likewise, important work is being done by critical race theorists around decentering whiteness, as though somehow that's not part of the conversation on race. Of course, it has to be. It's a tougher row to hoe, I think, with childhood because of how closely we have associated the idea with the figure of the child. And yet, when we step back and look at how childhood operates as a governance technology more broadly, we see that, in fact, it is not confined to the figure of the child. One thinks of the discourse that took place around the standoff a few years ago, if I can call it that, between Donald Trump and Kim in North Korea, and how they were so often caricatured and characterized as childish, right? Childishness is a really powerful rhetorical resource. You only have to watch a little bit of the session of any pretty much legislative assembly to see how many times childishness or the idea of childish behavior is invoked. Listen to it in social settings, follow it on the news, and see how many times political commentators unproblematically refer to childishness as a problem and about leaders or others needing to grow up. This is something that at least I think political commentators on the TV couldn't as easily do with respect to gender or race. So we have a long way to go on childhood yet. But maybe one way of getting there is thinking about it as a governance technology. And I think also maybe looking to find the ways in which children are important subjects in the reproduction of the everyday. That can be in the domestic labor they perform. It can be the work they do as, in some instances, child soldiers. It can be in the everyday of the relatively privileged environs of the global north, how they participate in remaking the knowledges, the values, and so forth of militarism in their daily encounters with it, and what they bring to that to making meaning then of the conflicts that we see unfolding in our world today, or the history lessons around past wars and so forth. Those are the two places that I would look for hope, is the possibility, on the one hand, of understanding childhood as something that needs to be disaggregated from the figure of the child because it operates much more broadly throughout the everyday of all of our lives as a governance technology, and also the possibility of seeing how children are important in remaking the worlds that we share.
Again, really fascinating. I was thinking as you were talking about the powerful rhetorical resource of the language of childishness, for example, about the way in which simply as parents, we are often setting up in children's minds the idea that adulthood is the goal, that being a child is unfinished somehow, that it's a process on the way to adulthood. And, you talking about this, the gender as a binary with male set up as the ideal, adult is set up as the ideal, or certain kinds of adulthood is set up as the ideal. So children are socialized very, very early on into thinking of themselves as unfinished and on their route to some form of perfection or finishing off. And that then combines with the ways in which they're socialized into all sorts of other ways of thinking, and that their militarization and so on then participates in remaking the world. So given us lots to think about there, Marshall. And as you say, also distinguishing the concept of the child from children themselves, and really looking hard at those concepts, those ideas we have about childhood separately from children. A final question, if I may: what is your work going to be focusing on over the next couple of years? Are you going to do more work on the militarisation of childhood, more on children as political subjects, or both, or other things altogether?
Both, though I'm just embarking on a year's research leave, and I'm working on a book on the militarization of childhood in the everyday, but I'm looking in different settings at this militarization taking place through what I'm calling everyday pedagogies. So that ranges from things like the ubiquity of war remembrance, which can be something as half noticed as the cenotaph in the town square. In some places, macro artifacts of war and militarism, like forts or museumized warships that dominate urban waterfronts. Big events. On Saturday of this weekend, I'm going to an air show that's being billed as a family event, where there will be overwhelmingly, if not entirely, military aircraft. I was recently at a similar sort of event, which was a tank show, live demonstrations of real tanks firing blanks with all sorts of pyrotechnics, and infantry in World War II and also Gulf War uniform enacting combat. Of course, nobody was dead or dismembered at the end of it, and so it all appeared as great fun. That's one instance. There was even an area at the tank show set aside as, under signage, as the kids zone, where, among other activities, children could don a World War II German infantry helmet and throw replica World War II era German stick grenades at a Soviet helmet. And the prize, I think it was a participation prize, I'm not sure they had to actually hit the helmet, was a plastic green army man of the sort that I recall having wanted for Christmas, and my wish was fulfilled when I was still a preschooler at a time when the Vietnam War was at its height. It connected an awful lot of dots for me. I'm looking at things too, like the sense of ubiquity of threat in society, the see something, say something campaign. There's a lot of signage in the mundane spaces of children's lives, reminding us that danger lurks everywhere. Architectures of schools that take inspiration from World War I trenches to limit sightlines, lockdown provisions in schools, all of these sorts of things that reinforce a militarist ontology of the ubiquity of danger and of our vulnerability to the predations of others. Of course, the military isn't directly implicated either in school shootings or in remediation of school shootings, but this is just one of the other ways in which an idea necessary to underwrite militarist excess is reproduced in children's everydays. So those are the kinds of things that I'm going to spend the next year, from children's leisure activities to school curricula and other things, thinking about, and we'll hopefully have a book by the end of all of it.
I very much look forward to reading it. It's going to be fascinating and important work, really drawing attention, as you say, to these everyday militarisms, which go so unseen and are so little scrutinized in society. Thank you for a really fascinating conversation, Marshall. You've transformed how I think, not just about the militarization of children, but about childhood itself. So I've got a lot to take away and digest, and I'm sure our listeners will have too. And I'm really grateful to you for taking time to talk to me. And I hope it'll be the start of many more conversations.
I certainly hope so. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you also to you, our listeners, for joining us again. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Professor J. Marshall Beier as much as I did. Keep listening out for more podcasts. In the autumn, we're going to be releasing a small mini-series looking at how we visualize the aftermath of war, from the rupture of forced migration to the texture of post-conflict landscapes. And some of these podcasts are going to be setting up a series of art exhibitions that we're running over the course of 2023, looking at historic and contemporary forced migrations in Europe, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Iraq. So do tune into them when they come out. If you've got any questions about our work on how children experience, narrate, and can help us rethink war and peace, do get in touch. You can follow us on social media, just search for Visualising War, or contact us directly by emailing us at viswar@standrews.ac.uk. If you'd like to support our project, please share and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you use so you don't miss an episode. And please do leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Sophia Gertin. Thank you for listening.